Well, Bill English delivered his 8th budget yesterday, and with the government's accounts back in the black, science and health got the lion's share of the new spending. The opposition parties say the budget did nothing to address the housing crisis in New Zealand and also address a range of other social problems. But with an improving set of accounts, Bill English has options going into the election and also has the chance to deliver tax cuts. We'll talk about all this morning. You can listen to us as usual, but you can also watch us this morning. We're streaming this live on rnz.co.nz, or you can watch us on Freeview Channel 50. Let's crack into it and welcome our panel of experts this morning. With me are Bernard Hickey, publisher of Hive News. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Kim Campbell from the Employers and Manufacturers Association. Thanks very much for coming in. Deborah Russell is with me. She's a tax specialist at Massey University, former Labour Party candidate. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning.
And Dr. Raymond Miller from Auckland University. Thanks for coming in.
Pleasure.
Let's just start by characterising the budget. Bernard, if I could start with you. It's been, well, certainly wasn't a black budget. It wasn't the mother of all budgets. Some people have called it the bland budget or the boring budget. How would you characterise it?
Well, I think it's a holding pattern budget. It's the government flying over the economy and over the election cycle, getting ready to come into land next year with a big set of tax cuts. No big change in altitude, no big turbulence, but they're getting ready to come in next year with a set of tax cuts, maybe 2 to 3 billion, according to the Prime Minister.
Kim?
Can't disagree with that. It's as far as business is concerned, it's business as usual. We like predictability. Boring is very good. Going into positive territory, you have to say it's a real accomplishment for, an OECD country. We have to recognise, though, however, we've got the math working for us here. We have a growing economy. We've had a number of years of reasonably strong growth, and so we have a bigger undertaking. So what looks like generosity in here is really recycling what the economy is already generating. There's something in there for most people, I think.
So boring and good.
Boring and good, absolutely.
Deborah?
I actually think it's a sneaky budget. It's touted as being generous and is offering plenty here, there and everywhere to invest. But in actual fact, by the time you take inflation and population growth into account, we've got cuts across all sorts of core areas. And we've actually got the Minister of Finance touting the ideal that they're getting back to down below 30% of GDP as government as a percentage of the economy. Now, that's an ideological choice about having smaller government, and it's being sneaked through in this budget.
Raymond?
Yes, first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge the stewardship of the economy by Bill English over 8 years. And this is a midterm budget, as Bernard just pointed out. But I think it really is opportunity lost as far as I'm concerned. The overarching plan, the sense of vision over the next 4 years is missing from this budget. And without wanting to be too cynical, there's a lot of band-aids being applied here and there. And I think that is unfortunate. Here is a government that has unparalleled popularity. Here is a government that is very stable. Here is a government that's going to post surpluses over the next few years. And yet, the problem is that it's not prepared to spend any political capital in order to provide the leadership that a lot of New Zealanders would want.
Interesting. We'll get back to that, but let's start with the economy, and we did mention that briefly. But Bernard, it's pretty hard to argue that these books aren't in pretty good order.
Yeah, we're looking at surpluses heading towards 6 billion by 2020, and the economy is growing a bit faster, according to the Treasury's forecast in the budget. And the government is building up a stock of money that it can use in 2-3 years' time on those tax cuts. And also, inflation is forecast to head back towards the middle of the target band. The key risks here for the government are whether inflation actually does get back up there, because it's relying on that inflation to grow the economy and therefore get a fiscal tailwind to grow its surplus, and also whether migration comes back down to 12,000 as Treasury's
Well,
forecasting.
that's right. I mean, that's a massive prediction, because it's the thick end of 70,000. They're predicting that it is going to drop down to 12,000. Surely that would have a large impact on the economy.
We've got to be careful here. I mean, immigration's nice because it makes the numbers look bigger, but actually we have to have all New Zealanders producing more. I mean, if those people come in and don't produce anything, we're no better off. One of the things that sits under this, and whilst they've never characterised it as much of a strategy, they've actually been reasonably successful in recalibrating the economy, and the downturn in dairy not actually causing a serious recession is an indicator of that. And you can see in this budget more investment in science and technology, the apprenticeship scheme, which has been pretty much a continuation of things that have been going on for some time. They're working. It's no doubt that they're working.
Well, Deborah?
Well, what worries me, though, about sort of the economic predictions in this budget is there's some pretty heroic assumptions in there. So if you look at the dairy price, they're predicting that it's going to recover by 50% within a couple of years. Now, I'm not quite sure that that's actually going to happen. And if you look at their housing inflation indicators, they're saying there's going to be, I think, 6 or 7 or 8% inflation over the next couple of years. Then suddenly it's going to drop to 2% inflation in house prices. So I really think that some of those assumptions are perhaps a bit off or optimistic. So I'm not sure that we're going to get the kind of growth in the economy that's going to underpin those surpluses in later years.
Raymond, you were underwhelmed when you characterised it in the summation of the budget, but you could argue they've done a lot of sort of worthy stuff here. That $411 million for science and innovation, the apprenticeships that Kim mentioned are the thick end of $260 million. So it's stuff that aren't great media stories, but they are also the kinds of things that people say that we need to do. So do you give them credit there?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I can see some definite pluses in this budget. Research and development, for one. Some of the healthcare initiatives sound very interesting indeed, particularly the melanoma, making drugs available for men.
Which was pre-announced, wasn't it?
That's right. But part of the trouble with the boring nature of the budget is there's so much is pre-announced.
We've opened all the presents before
That's
Christmas
right.
Day.
There's almost nothing left, and that's part of the problem for any commentators like myself.
I think probably the real thing is what isn't in there going on. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's not in there. I mean, we have a serious problem in housing here in Auckland, and I know we're going to get to
We're going to move to housing soon, but I do want to stay with health because Raymond mentioned it.
Yeah.
On the face of it, Deborah, the numbers look big. $2.2 billion. Of course, it's over 4 years, 600 odd million a year. That's pretty much running to stand still, is it?
Even worse than that, if you crunch the numbers through looking at the growth in the population and accounting for inflation, by 2020 we're spending $300 less a head on health. Now, again, that's a decision that this government can make, but it's a choice to pull back out of the health sector. And it's not clear that New Zealanders have agreed to that. And we can tell they haven't agreed to it because they are protesting about healthcare.
We're also going to ask where the money's being spent in health, and there is quite a wellness program underlying all this. They're trying to get people off the smokes. People who smoke aren't going to be very happy because the cigarettes are more expensive, but those who are paying the health bills certainly think it's a good idea. Also, there's work in diabetes, there's work in obesity, there's all sorts of areas where we're trying to get people to live longer and to be cheaper to keep, to be frank.
One thing that wasn't in there, Bernard, I know this is something you've written and spoken a lot about, superannuation and any changes there. One figure that really struck me was that we're spending $12.9 billion, nearly $13 billion on superannuation, and that is more than the entire welfare budget. It's a pretty extraordinary number.
Yeah, whenever you actually look through the core data in the budget to find out where the big increases in spending are, the one that's never announced is how big the increase for New Zealand superannuation was. Not because any rates have changed or because there's been any policy change, simply because the number of people, as we expected, get older. They retire, and often they keep working and collecting the New Zealand
Not
superannuation.
one question about that, though, yesterday,
No,
was there?
no.
Just off the table, because Keir said he's still trying to ditch over.
There was some interesting news on the area, which was bringing forward the contributions to the New Zealand Superannuation Fund by 2 years.
What, to 2021?
That's right. From 2022, 23, as it was in December.
Never, though, isn't it? I mean, he's never going to do it, is he? He doesn't want to put any money into the super fund, does he?
I asked Bill English whether it was one of the choices the government had when it comes to thinking about tax cuts next year. And if the fiscal pressure is really on and the political pressure, then the government's going to have a choice between some juicy tax cuts or contributions to the super fund.
How many votes are they going to win doing that?
That's right.
Well, the problem with the superannuation issue is it's such a political hot potato. I mean,
Labour's run a mile from it too.
No, it hasn't run a mile from it. I think there's still work going on, thinking really hard about how to manage the super.
Yeah, I thought they'd taken the age of retirement off, or the age at which you get the pension intervention off the table?
For the time being, yes. But
one
certainly there's work going on. And no, the Labour Party is not withdrawing from having a really good look about how to manage super. Now, that might be working with more contributions.
Asset testing?
There could be all sorts of things you do, and it's certainly something that you'd want to deploy the resources of government to actually having a really good look at it. And it's astonishing that this government isn't doing it. There is that.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah. But it's a huge policy issue, and there seems to be no work going on from this government about it.
Well, the one person yesterday in the response to the budget who did raise this issue is David Seymour, in fact. And it was interesting, both he and Peter Dunn, representing support parties, were very critical of aspects of this budget, as well as supporting other aspects. But one that David Seymour was critical of was the failure to address the superannuation issue.
I suspect it's actually a bigger issue than budget.
Too big for the budget.
It's a policy issue.
Fair enough. Let's get to housing, because this was a big thing, a big thing in the lead up. And in fact, it really clouded the whole set up to the budget for the government, didn't it, Bernard? Were you underwhelmed by what was on offer for housing?
Yeah, this was a quite reactive budget in that it dealt with some of the population changes, but it didn't look at the broader issues which are actually driving a lot of the fiscal problems for the government. You've got rising rent subsidies, which are a direct result of these rising house prices.
It become part of the problem.
That's right, in rents. And this is something that was missing from the budget, a real infrastructure response in Auckland. The government instead chose to repay debt, and it still has this thorny issue of how do you ask or force Auckland to go out and up when Auckland doesn't have the funding to pay for the infrastructure.
And it seems counterintuitive, given that the cost of money is very low, the accounts are good. Why would you be trimming the infrastructure spending at that point?
That's exactly right. In fact, the government reduced its capital allowance in this budget from 1.7 billion to 1.4 billion. And also, when you look at the needs in Auckland, there is a little contingency fund they put in there of around $800 million, which may be used for Auckland. But the core problem here is that Auckland is bursting at the seams. It needs infrastructure. The council is up against its debt limits, and the government would like the council to get on with building all the things you need for these houses, but it doesn't have the funding.
Well, there was one interesting thing sort of buried in there, wasn't it? The national policy statement, which they may direct councils to allow more housing development where necessary and to measure the impact of their decisions on house prices. I spoke to a senior minister last night, just before I left Wellington, who sort of had a bit of a grin and said this could be interesting. Now, I don't quite know what they meant by that.
Well, it sets up a really good bit of a dynamic discussion between central government and the local bodies. What they need to do is reform the Local Government Act, actually. What we need to do is reform the planning laws. None of this really should be debated in the budget. It's not a budgetary thing. We're not short of money. It's just how we spend it. And certainly as far as Auckland is concerned, clearly Aucklanders haven't run out of money because they're spending crazy amounts on houses. But we need to actually restructure the way we go about building things.
Well, couldn't they, I mean, this might sound naive, but couldn't they just undertake or underwrite somehow a big house building program? Get out there with a hammer and nails and actually build them.
Yes, I mean, the problem with the present policy is that the government has gone for the long game rather than the short game. That is, building houses is going to take time. This is going to be an expense that the government realises it's committing itself to. But the problem is it's going to go way beyond the next election. So this is going to become increasingly difficult politically for the government to manage.
Well, that's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because one of the big numbers to keep in mind here is 65%. That is the number of New Zealanders who actually own a home. So politically, set all the other stuff aside, politically there are more winners in house prices rising than losers for the government, and they will be very aware.
Some of us are going to start being losers soon because our own house prices might be going up, but we have children who are going to want to buy houses one day, and so we're starting to get increasing stories about young professionals who can't afford to buy a house, and then you get some of the issues around places like Queenstown where there is huge pressure on house prices, so that the people we need to run our communities, like teachers and police officers, can't afford to live there.
And we've got a problem with getting people to come to Auckland and work, so it's fool's gold.
Yeah,
look, everyone is deluding themselves. They think they're better off. And bearing in mind, most of this, not all of it, is on debt. And we are one of the most indebted nation on earth. Our personal household debt
Bernard
as per
doesn't seem convinced
GDP
there.
has gone up
For those
from
watching this.
40% of GDP to 160% in 5 years. It's the greatest growth in household debt growth in the world's
All right.
history.
Can we talk about a few of the things that they actually did do on housing, or did you want to make a point?
Well, the government debt is actually very low.
I'm talking about personal
that's
household
right.
debt.
Okay.
That's right.
Well,
and
they-
if the households can't afford to pay for the infrastructure, then maybe it's time for
All
the
you need
government
is a
to step
small increase in interest rates, and this is going to be a train wreck.
in. We'll see.
They put $100 million into buying Crown land, but we already own that anyway.
Yeah, and there's some shuffling going on here. Particularly, for example, they're selling almost half of KiwiBank to the New Zealand Super Fund, which they're taking into account as part of their capital recycling programs. Essentially, the government has announced yesterday that they're going to repay $9.2 billion worth of debt in the 3 years to 2020. And the question should be asked, should that money have been redeployed into infrastructure for Auckland or housing?
I want to
agree
address
with
the social housing. We talked a little bit about some of the housing issues and prices, but what about the social housing stuff? Because this was a massive focus in the days leading up to the budget, but I presume that the thing was already put to bed by the time the media decided to go really hard on housing.
One of the things we can tell that it had already been put to bed was that when Paula Bennett made her announcement, I think on Wednesday,
Didn't
was
tell
it?
Bill English.
Didn't tell Bill English, and it isn't in the bump that's come out
No,
of the
true,
budget
it's
at
not.
all. It's just not there. And, when you look at these numbers and you start to push them a bit, they're just not very good anyway. I think we asked a Treasury official, and it turns out there's actually only 120 million for new social housing in
Not
Auckland.
the 260 or so.
Well,
that was-
there's 200 million or so, but 41 of that is the income-related rents.
and those
all
beds
right.
weren't
Some of it's the
new
Tamaki
anyway.
redevelopment, and again, when you ask them a bit more, that 120 million, it'll come up with 750 homes. Now, I don't think that's nearly enough in Auckland. The pressures are much, much greater than that.
I want to talk about tax. There's the prospect of tax cuts, but firstly, on the revenue gathering side, there was a bit of a grab on smokers. A 10% increase in the excise from the 1st of January. I think that goes for 4 years, doesn't it? And it generates something like 425 million over 4 years. It's pretty handy for the government. How do you think that's going to play, Raymond?
Well, I think, again, David Seymour actually brought this up yesterday, and this is the concern that many people will have, that those who are going to be most hit by this will in fact be those people who are dependent on smoking, heavily dependent, and low-income people. They're the ones who are going to face quite a huge increase. And if they continue to be dependent on cigarettes, then what's going to happen is that the money has to come from somewhere else in the domestic budget.
Well, Winston Peters went as far as saying that there will be children who won't be fed because of this, because you're looking at a $30 packet of cigarettes. But it's a rare and brave, and he probably is rare and brave politician who actually is going to stand up for smokers, isn't it, in 2016?
Well, that's absolutely right. And the other issue, of course, is that, packets of cigarettes will become we talked about this, increasingly contraband. And this is going to have implications for the way we conduct law and order in the city of Auckland and elsewhere.
The interesting thing here too is that it's also a tax increase which is not distributionally neutral. So the government made a really big point when they did the big tax switch in 2010 that when they made the changes it wouldn't hurt some parts of the population more than others.
Weren't we also promised no new taxes?
Well, yes, there's that too.
I think they just broke a promise.
But this is the second
Define tax.
But this is the second of these tax increases that we've seen, which actually hurts those on the lower income scale the most, because the increase in petrol taxes, which has been done, again, one of these sequential significant increases year upon year that's happened over the last 3 to 4 years, has actually, again, hurt those people who have to spend more of their income on petrol.
Yeah,
to
but
get
that's
to and
getting
from work.
recycled back into infrastructure, so I don't have a problem.
Let's have a
with it.
look at this, to me, pretty confusing picture of whether or not tax cuts are on the agenda and how big they will be. Is there an appetite? I mean, it's a fairly low tax system we've got. Is there an appetite, even from the business community?
We just look at what's competitive. I mean, the main thing that we concern ourselves with is, are we competitive with our trading nations? If the Australians drop corporate tax, then the worry is where the head office is going to be.
But I'll pick you up on that, because isn't part of the problem is that they aren't paying the tax anyway?
Well,
they're shifting their profits
and
around.
I don't think anyone in the business community disagrees that something has to be
Not
done.
New Zealand businesses, but
but worldwide, the business community says, look, this is something, it's obnoxious. And we see it the same with internet trade and a whole lot of other areas.
But is there an appetite, is there room, is it desirable in your view to cut the personal income tax rates?
I believe so, because what happens, well, there's a threshold where the tax avoidance industry becomes the biggest industry of all. And by lowering tax rates, people have more money in their pockets to increase their disposable income.
Deborah?
And I've argued we've had high enough headline wages in New Zealand. Our problem has been disposable income.
Okay, but if you look at all those tax thresholds at the moment, in terms of the number of taxpayers earning over $70,000, it's about 14% of taxpayers. So if you're going to have tax cuts, the government is promising us around about $3 billion, and you can see in those out-year surpluses that money's available. That's maybe $847 a taxpayer over a year, and it just depends on where you put it in the income scale. If you want it to benefit everyone, it's got to go down at the lower thresholds.
Those income earners over 70,000 are paying 60% of the entire tax rate.
No, that's not correct either. What you need to look, well, you can look at those numbers there. But one of the interesting ways to think about it is, say, the top 10% of taxpayers. Now, the top 10% of taxpayers cut in at 81,000. They pay 45% of all income tax, but they also earn 33% of all income. Sure. And that's not counting wealth accumulation.
Okay, let's finish this up in a nice segue with how this is going to play politically. Raymond, you think that this is setting it up for the stage of tax cuts in 2017? Is that going to look like a tired trick from National again?
It may well do, but everyone wants a tax cut.
Really? I wonder.
I think when we survey people,
they do.
They want a tax cut, both on the people who vote on the right and those who vote on the left.
Really?
Yeah, but the thing is that the implications of all of this, of course, is that less can then be spent on health, less on education, less on housing. There are implications that need to be spelt out. But I think it's just such a big issue for National going into its fourth election in a row. They need to ensure that they get back at the end of next year. Tax cuts will do it for them, they'll argue, and it's just
what's
too
going
tempting.
on, Deborah, with the Finance Minister, Prime Minister seeming to be singing from different song sheets on this? Is this a game? Have they worked this
I
out?
don't think they are really. I think I'm sure. Yeah, and I'm sure Mr. Keir had a thorough look at the budget figures, and he saw those $3 billion, $6 billion surpluses in the out years. He knows what Mr. English is building towards there.
The reason why the tax cuts are important is it's the middle income New Zealanders that need a break. The hard-working two-income families. I heard at your radio station $90,000 a year and having trouble making ends meet. They need relief. And you want them to continue to have the incentive to work hard. And by the way, we didn't mention the rejigging of PAYE for provisional taxpayers.
No,
brilliant thing for business.
And again,
That's
that present was
a good
unwrapped
thing for
before
business.
Christmas Day.
Yeah.
Bernard, if I could finish with you, because we are running out, we've got to get to the 7:30 headlines. How do you think this is going to play politically? This is really just setting the stage, is it, for next year?
Yeah, it sets them up for a debate going into the 2017 election about whether or not tax cuts are the way to go, or whether the government should be investing that money in dealing with the infrastructure issues in Auckland, which mean that they may well get a little bit more money back in their pay after tax, but if they're stuck in traffic and the cost of their house has just risen $1,400 a day, as it did in March and April, then you have to wonder whether tax cuts are better than spending on that infrastructure.
We better wrap this up now. Bernard Hickey, thank you very much for coming in. Kim Campbell, thank you. Deborah Russell, thank you for joining us. And Raymond Miller. Now, that's us for our post-budget breakfast special. Back to you in Wellington, Susie.
And coming up before 8 o'clock on Morning Report, dairy farmers react to a worse than expected price